We know that Zen 4 is AMD's latest and greatest on the mainstream desktop CPU market, but let's not forget about the big dog from years gone by for prosumers and workstation users, Threadripper. Of course, the last high-end desktop prosumer level Threadripper processors that we saw were the Zen 2 base 3000 series that was flagshipped by the awesome 64-core 3990X. AMD has, however, launched the more workstation-focused Zen 3-based Threadripper Pro 5000WX series in recent months. This lineup is once again flagshipped by a 64-core £7,000 model, the Threadripper Pro 5995WX. We're also looking at the 32-core $3,500 5975WX and the 24-core $2,500 5965WX in today's mini review, or wow, look at that piece of content. So with 120 total cores of Threadripper Pro goodness, 256GB of DDR4 memory and a WRX80 motherboard at hand, let's take a closer look. We wrote an introduction article about AMD's Threadripper Pro 5000WX series processors back when AMD introduced them in March 2022, so you'll find more of the in-depth details over there if you want to go and have a look at that. Fundamentally, AMD maintains the consistent Threadripper formula with this Zen 3 iteration. Zen 3 chiplets deploying 32 megs of L3 cache and up to 8 cores are deployed alongside a central I/O die. For the flagship 5995WX, that gives a total of 64 processing cores alongside 256 megabytes of level 3 cache. And that's because it uses 8 core chiplets. However, the 32 core and 24 core parts that we're also looking at, they use 4 Zen 3 core chiplets, so you get up to 128 megabytes of L3 cache on both of those parts. They differ by core count, of course, though. As we expect from Zen 3, they're built on 7nm TSMC FinFET technology. And AMD rates each Threadripper Pro processor with a beefy 280-watt TDP. That translates into maximum boost clocks of 4.5 GHz on all three models that we're looking at today. So that Precision Boost 2 algorithm is looking pretty healthy given the substantial TDP on the chips. Of course, what you actually get for all core workloads is going to differ, and the smaller core count part is going to run quicker. But you do get the ability to overclock the processors, or I should say tweak the processors, if your motherboard supports it. Unfortunately, our Asus One does not. These Zen 3-based Threadripper Pro processors drop into the same SWRX8 socket and WRX80 platform as their Zen 2 Threadripper 3000WX predecessors. That means that potentially, if you've got a BIOS update for your motherboard, or for your workstation, I guess, then you can drop these chips directly in as a quick and easy upgrade. The WRX80 platform is a bit of a monster, and that's thanks in large to AMD's really healthy allocation of features on the built-in I/O die on the processors. Perhaps most importantly to many customers is that you get support for 8-channel DDR4 memory. This allows the installation of not gigabyte levels of system memory, but terabyte levels, depending on the motherboard and memory DIMM support, of course. You can also choose whether to install ECC or non-ECC memory. Our Asus motherboard, for example, takes either. And speed-wise, this Threadripper Pro iteration is actually pretty good. It supports 3200 MHz by default, and that's pretty good for the Infinity Fabric tie-in, which is a 1600 MHz link, which isn't too far away from the 3600 MHz memory and 1800 MHz fabric, which was the sweet spot for Zen 2 and Zen 3. So yeah, good memory speed support on this. Plus, of course, if your motherboard supports it, you can run XMP. It's exactly what we did. And the other key area of connectivity is absolutely superb. That's the PCIe lanes. By default, every Threadripper Pro WX series processor gives you 128 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe connectivity. That's fundamentally outstanding, particularly to multi-GPU, machine learning or AI nerds. And actually, a recent visit to the EKWB booth at CES 2023 showed a real-world use case of a system running something like Threadripper Pro with 4, maybe 7 GPUs in there. That's using, say, 112 lanes of PCIe connectivity, which this platform will deliver. So if you have a really GPU-heavy workload, rendering, animation, AI, machine learning, scientific research, that type of thing, you can run one of the cheaper, i.e. lower core count processors alongside your copious amounts of graphics cards. That's a really cool feature for the platform. And then looking at the Asus ProWS WRX80E Sage SE Wi-Fi motherboard, try saying that quickly, that we have for sample testing, it's easy to see that it's an all-round monster. Firstly, the weight is significant, the physical size is massive, and the build quality feels great. The 16-stage VRM is well cooled by hefty metal heat sinks, so I have no worry about pushing a sustained 280 watt processor on this motherboard, particularly as the UEFI does not currently permit overclocking or precision boost overdrive. You will notice that the SWRX8 socket is rotated 90 degrees from convention. This changes the 8 DIMM slots to be 4 above and 4 below the socket. Fundamentally, this is not an issue, but it can cause some headaches with CPU cooler choice, chassis installation preferences, and airflow directionality. For example, our Ice Giant ProSiphon Elite CPU cooler is an awesome unit for Threadripper based processors, but it only works in certain orientations due to its unique cooling technology. So that's something to watch out for with the rotated socket. Asus gives this roughly £1,000 motherboard all the usual and expected connectivity. There's ample SATA, plenty of USB, 20 gigabits per second Type-C, and a good audio connector. Added into that mix is dual 10 gigabit Ethernet via an Intel X550A2T chipset plus 2x2 Wi-Fi 6. Treble M.2 slots all get decent metal heatsink cooling and can run at PCIe Gen 4x4 bandwidth. And Asus even includes a pair of U.2 connectors, which is potentially a reasonable move for a workstation level product, despite U.2 being practically dead on the consumer market. Those U.2 ports, they do share bandwidth with 2 of the M.2 ports though, so that's something to watch out for. And I guess the only omission that I can really see is glaringly obvious is Thunderbolt, which is something that I personally quite like. I think the ecosystem is very good, particularly for a workstation like this. And then just rounding out some points with the motherboard, alongside the usual 24-pin and dual 8-pin EPS power connectors, you get an additional dual 6-pin PCIe plus an 8-pin PCIe to feed additional juice for heavy multi-GPU setups. You've got IPMI, BMC, you've got a KVM on there. You've got a micro SD card slot on board, which is good for licenses or OS installation. So yeah, there's plenty going on. Proper workstation level stuff indeed. I guess, like I say, the only omission is perhaps Thunderbolt, depending on your preference, and the inability to do any form of frequency tuning, like overclocking, as we see from some of the SWRX8 competitors. The MSI board sticks in my mind, for example. We need to start out by saying that we don't have access to the relevant Intel Xeon processors that these Threadripper Pro chips realistically compete with. To be honest, this is more of a showcase or overview, not a sponsored project, but more of a hands-on test showing what Threadripper Pro actually delivers in some of our real-world mainstream desktop benchmarks, just as a comparison point, as a, wow, look at that feature piece. For memory, Kingston kindly loaned us 256 gigabytes of their Fury Renegade DDR4 RGB memory. This comes in 8x32 gigabyte form, so we'll run 8 channel in this test system. The memory is non-ECC, but that's fine for our testing. ECC support is available on the platform if your specific workloads require it. And the speed is 3200 MHz at CL16, running 1.35 volts XMP. CPU cooling comes in the form of the superb Ice Giant ProSiphon Elite. This 4-fan aluminium CPU cooler uses thermosiphon technology to achieve comfortably the best Threadripper cooling performance that we have observed in previous testing. 280 watts of heat load is easy for this CPU cooler, and that's particularly true with Threadripper, given the ProSiphon Elite's ability to fully cover the heat spreader thanks to its massive base and sturdy mounting solution. And then for the graphics card, we run an AMD Radeon RX 6950 XT, not that it is doing any work in our CPU focus testing. Plus, clean power comes from a high-end Seasonic power supply that can deliver well over a kilowatt sustained, and that's probably a sensible option for a system that can draw such copious amounts of power on the CPU and GPU side if we pushed both. Like we've already said, with regards to testing and benchmarking, we're not going to run these processes to the nth degree. We're going to focus on a, wow, look at that feature piece versus some of the mainstream desktop parts. So we're going to run our usual benchmarks, Cinebench, Blender, Handbrake, 7-zip, that type of thing. Obviously, people are going to run different workloads here. You'll have different simulation packages, CAD packages, animation, etc., etc. Those workloads are really niche. They're probably $50,000 a year licensing costs for some of the software I used to use, so we're not really going to run that. If you have those specific use cases, you probably know the software that you're using and what type of hardware that you need. So this is more of a cool showpiece rather than focusing on those niche software packages. And as always, if you want more details on the test procedure, the system, the competing hardware, then check out the main KitGuru written page. Let's jump into it. Looking at power consumption, it's a pretty easy one to analyze. AMD provides the Threadripper Pro 5000WX series processors with a 280 watt TDP across the board. And this 280 watt TDP means 280 watts actually delivered, aside from minor overshoots of course, unlike the Intel and AMD desktop TDP nonsense. That 280 watt TDP is likely a restriction for the 64 core chip's operating clocks, given that it operates almost a gigahertz slower than the 32 core model. In fact, you can check out some of our previous content with the 64 core Threadripper 3990X non-pro CPU, where we PBO overclocked it to roughly 3.6 GHz, which mandated a package power draw of almost 500 watts. There's no reason to suggest why this Threadripper Pro 5995WX could not go to frequencies similar to the 32 and 24 core chips when coupled with a relevant motherboard and CPU cooler. You may be surprised to see such reasonable temperature numbers given that Ryzen 7000 series and Intel 13th gen processors running anywhere near 280 watts of package power would be operating like furnaces. But this is simply the case with Threadripper, and it seemingly always has been. Having a heat spreader the size of a mobile phone clearly aids thermal performance, plus having all those cores spread across a larger physical PCB area helps to control the thermal density headaches that we often see with mainstream desktop chips. Now yes, we are using an incredibly high-end CPU cooler in the Ice Giant ProSiphon Elite, but this £150 quad fan cooler is clearly not out of place for such expensive partnering hardware. Plus the Noctua NHU14S TR4 SP3 is another cooler that we've had great success with on Threadripper, thanks in large to its full-sized base contact area. Put simply, there's no reason to see why temperatures will be an issue for Threadripper Pro when used with sensible air coolers, and that's advantageous given the usage environments. Air coolers are ideal for 24/7 low noise operation, which is exactly how these workstation CPUs may be running. Plus, when we're recording temperatures below 70 degrees Celsius under full load, there's not much concern of long, multi-day rendering or simulation workloads spiraling temperature to the point of clock speed throttling. Once again, AMD has clearly nailed it when it comes to thermal design for Threadripper Pro. Looking at multi-threaded rendering, it is easy to see the segregation between the mainstream desktop CPUs and the workstation-orientated ones. Put simply, the 128-thread Threadripper Pro 5995WX is an absolute rendering powerhouse. It completes its Blender rendering task in less than half the time of the Ryzen 9 7950X, meaning that a doubling of work queue throughput is achievable. The 32-core 5975WX is no slouch either, and sits nicely between the 24-core and 64-core models. Looking at the 5965WX though, this is clearly a processor that is better suited for its arsenal of memory bandwidth and connectivity as opposed to its raw compute horsepower. And that's because the less than £700 Zen 4 based Ryzen 9 7950X is almost as fast, but much, much cheaper. Single-threaded performance is unsurprisingly weak, but that's because we are looking at Zen 3 cores and clocks in the world of Zen 4 and Raptor Lake. The key reference point here, however, is that AMD's lightly threaded performance isn't significantly disadvantaged when comparing to the chips with the same architecture. This is testament to the excellent abilities of AMD's Precision Boost 2 algorithm. Let's now look at some memory-related performance for this platform with 8-channel 3200MHz RAM. Wow! Even despite a sizable frequency disadvantage versus DDR5-based mainstream platforms that are using 6000 MHz kits, the memory bandwidth numbers output by Threadripper Pro are fantastic. It is clear to see that 8-channel memory running at solid frequencies of 3200 MHz DDR4 is an excellent solution for memory bandwidth intensive workloads, and that memory bandwidth capacity is clearly one of the star factors for Threadripper Pro. Latency isn't all that bad either, particularly since we're using 3200 MHz C16 DIMMs as opposed to the dual rank 3600MHz C16 modules used for other DDR4 platforms. And we don't see weird memory latency behavior that we saw with early Threadripper models either. Each core gets better access to the memory controller on the central I/O die, so it fixes that. Handbrake H.264 performance is strong from Threadripper Pro, given the high core counts. But the hierarchy of performance is not particularly positive, as a single instance of Handbrake simply cannot saturate 64 or more threads for our X264 workload. And that is even more the case for H.265 conversion, whereby our specific task really struggles to saturate 32 threads and higher CPUs. Of course, if you have different source media, then this may be a different equation for you. In this scenario, the obvious solution is to run multiple instances of Handbrake for the video conversion tasks, and this is something that I've done successfully for many years using Threadripper systems. Spooling up multiple instances of Handbrake doesn't improve individual conversion time per se, but it does allow more conversions to be completed in a given time frame, thus increasing the work queue throughput. 7-zip performance is incredibly strong despite being limited to 64 threads of operation. Here, the ludicrously high memory bandwidth is helping alongside the sizable number of cores and ample cache. The performance improvement from the 16-core Zen 4 Ryzen 9 7950X to the 24-core Zen 3 Threadripper Pro 5965WX emphasizes my previous point about the platform-wide scenarios whereby workstation-grade hardware can show value. Once again, 7-zip being limited to 64 threads gives ample opportunity for this workload to run close to full speed, whilst also running another hefty workload at the same time. For example, we run 2 instances of Handbrake with different conversion tasks alongside 7-zip. While none of these workloads saturate 128 threads by themselves, combined they can force full utilization of the 64-core Threadripper Pro 5995WX, and they do this with minimal slowdown to any of the workloads, thus resulting in a real throughput increase for a user's multiple tasks. And here are some cache and memory latency and bandwidth scores from Sysoft Sandra for reference, if you're interested in them. Unsurprisingly, it's pretty difficult to even compete with the Threadripper Pro 5995WX in Cinebench performance per watt data. 128 threads running at a sensible 280 watt TDP are very powerful for massively parallel multi-threaded tasks like rendering. Interestingly, the same cannot be said for the 24 and 32 core Threadripper Pros. Given their identical 280 watt TDPs, it is clear that AMD has pushed the frequency beyond its ideal efficiency operating point. I guess this is fine for extracting maximum performance from the processors, whereby the 64 core almost certainly leaves frequency on the table. Though for a workstation environment where added power usage translates directly into more costly electricity infrastructure and usage bills, as well as increased cooling requirements inside the workplace office environment, perhaps an eco-type mode of maybe 180 watts TDP would be useful. What do you think on that point? AMD's Threadripper Pro 5000WX series processors are super expensive, super high-end, super performant processors that undoubtedly appeal to a niche market. But they're also outstandingly well thought out products that tick many, many boxes and sit in a tier of their own, quite frankly. Sporting 64 compute cores, 256 megs of L3 cache and a £7,000 price tag in the UK, the Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5995WX is a true flagship processor in all essences of the word. Of course, the pricing is utterly insane to those of us who deal with the desktop mainstream consumer market on a day-to-day basis. But if this workstation-orientated 64-core chip allows your skilled video editor, or animator, or simulation engineer to complete value-added work tasks quicker, then it can potentially be justifiable for its price tag. If I'm a design engineer using an expensive processor like this that allows me to run 10 simulations in the same time that I could previously run 5 simulations before I have to hit that manufacturing slot on my multi-million-dollar additive manufacturing machine, then that can be of significant value. And a price tag of £7,000 or whatever it is in the US can easily be eaten up with just a few weeks worth of work there. And that's where the value-added aspect of this high performance really comes into its own, potentially. Depends on the industry, depends on the domain, depends on the company, depends on many factors, but there are genuine use cases. The reality, however, is that while the 64-core chip is nice, it isn't always justifiable, perhaps as our testing showed. I remember speaking to one of AMD's team who said that the 64-core actually does very well with customers in the domain of rendering and animation, and that's because those workloads often scale very well with high core counts. But for my own video editing workloads, for example, having the option to choose a 32-core chip for half the price is valuable. And the other key factor in this lineup is the 24-core model. While you aren't necessarily going to be getting performance that is much better than the sub £700 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X, you are getting access to the superb Threadripper Pro WRX80 platform. I recall dealing with multi-physics simulation workloads on a day-to-day basis in a previous life. Often the software wouldn't really scale with more than 16 CPU threads because the licensing made it expensive to do so, or because that's how the VMs were often carved up. Some of the software, however, would take as much GPU horsepower as you could throw at it. And this is a perfect example of where a 16 or 24 core CPU with 128 lanes of PCIe Gen 4 connectivity and 8-channel memory support can be useful. You don't have to pay top dollar for the flagship processor just to get that ample PCIe connectivity for your heavily GPU-centric or memory-centric workload. So I've openly proclaimed my love for the Threadripper and Threadripper Pro platforms many times in the past. I like the scalability up to 64 cores, I like 128 lanes of PCIe Gen 4 connectivity, and I like giving 8-channel memory to those who really need it. There are also some areas that I think that could really do with improvement though. The 280 watt consistent TDP is handy for system integration, no doubt, but it feels wasteful on a 24 core chip that is clearly operating way outside of its efficiency range. Of course there is frequency and presumably TDP adjusting ability, but that's a bit more nuanced than it isn't in all of the motherboard BIOSes. As much as I hate to say this, I think perhaps a slightly more sensible TDP, maybe 180 watts, for some of those lower core count parts would probably be sensible. So hopefully this has been an interesting showcase of the sheer performance offered by AMD's latest and greatest Threadripper Pro processors, albeit running on the Zen 3 architecture. That 64 core is utterly insane. To think there's £12,000 roughly worth of processors, actually £13,000 I think it is off the top of my head. Yeah, £13,000 worth of processors sat right there, 120 if I remember correctly. Compute cores, that's absolutely crazy. No point me giving this a review score because quite frankly, if you need the processor, then you're going to buy it. If you don't need it, then clearly you're not going to buy it. So yeah, hopefully that's been an exciting look at some of the sheer performance on offer. I've been Luke Hill for Kit Group. Thank you for watching our video mini review / overview / wow look at that feature on AMD's Ryzen Threadripper Pro 5000 WX series processors. As always, let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Can you actually think of some of your workloads on a day-to-day basis that could honestly use even the 32-core processor? Never mind the 64-core, even the 32-core processor. If you can, please let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear that. Go ahead and do all that usual YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, support the channel. Please check out the main KitGuru website for the written content. That really supports us massively. Check out Patreon, buy a cool t-shirt, interact with us on Discord and Twitter and the likes, and we will check you out in the next one.